Hello, everyone. It is Bible Scribe again. Thank you so much for joining me. Israel only destroyed by ancient texts. So I did not intend to do this video on the Israel only topic. I had that last video, which was very comprehensive on pseudepigrapha, early Christian writings, church father writings, the New Testament, the Old Testament, everything. We went through all of it. It was long. But as I was doing other study, as I often do, I ran across this. It just popped in my mind to check, what do Hebrew texts of the Gospels say about the nations, the Gentiles, the inclusion of the nations? And what I found was exactly what I expected to find, which was that, as we're going to see, we're going to go through some of these texts, and I will show you how the Jewish Hebrew word goyim is used to describe the nations in the New Testament, which flies in the face of and destroys the Israel-only argument that the word Gentiles in the New Testament was referring to either the northern or southern kingdom of Israel, which had been scattered throughout the heathen nations. No, this word goy or goyim, as used by the Jews, as we're going to see, is a term that does not mean Israelites or Jews and can only mean non-Jews, even in the modern time. So we're going to go through these texts. I don't think it'll take very long, but I wanted to show you this because, to me, just like in the last video, we had a couple things we went through that were the nail in the coffin, so to speak, for Israel only. But this one, to me, is another one of those things. It's like there is no possible way you can make the argument of Israel only when you see what I'm about to show you in these texts. So to do that, let me bring up my other screen here. The first text we're going to talk about is a text called the Peshitta. And the Peshitta was a Syriac version of the scriptures, the New Testament and the Old Testament. And it's still in use today by Eastern cultures. But we in the West did not take that version and use it. But this version that we're going to be looking at is dated by some scholars to about the time of Christ, where it was written, they say, in Old Syriac or Arabic. And by others, some dispute that, and they say no, that the version that they see in the Peshitta of the language there is not Old Syriac, it's newer, and so they date it to about the 5th century. In either case, this is a Hebrew text, and it is very old, very ancient, to the time of about the time of Christ. So I went here looking for, what does it say? And here's the link. You can get to the Peshitta online, and you can look at it, do your own research. And the text we're looking at here is Isaiah chapter 11, verse 10, that says, "Then in that day the nations," which is the word we're interested in. Is it nations meaning Gentiles, or is it nations meaning some sort of part of the tribes of Judah or the tribes of Israel, etc.? But it says, "Then in that day the nations will resort to the root of Jesse, who will stand as a signal for the peoples, and his resting place will be glorious." And talking about the root of Jesse here, we know this is talking about the coming Messiah. So this passage links all the things that we need to talk about in relationship to the Israel-only discussion. Well, what do we find here when we look at this? So I now have highlighted, and I'll zoom in on this. I have now highlighted the word that is translated nations in the English, and that word is no less than the word goyim. And I don't know if you haven't researched the Judaic religions very much, then you may not know this word. But when I hear this word, I know immediately that the Jews use this word to mean non-Jews, non-Israelites, non-Jews. It's everybody else, and they have used it for centuries, for millennia. It has always meant the same thing. So when you see this in an ancient Hebrew text, you know what it means. It does not have anything to do with any tribe of Israel. has absolutely nothing to do with that. So it's just another thing that's like, if you kind of make an Israel-only argument and use these words in our scriptures, you don't have a leg to stand on, because these words don't mean what you're saying they mean. And it doesn't matter how much you attack the English translations of these words, that is irrelevant, because these ancient manuscripts all say the words that you say in Israel only that they don't say, but they do. So that is the testimony of the Peshitta. Now I'm going to go to a different text. And this text, called the Shem Tov, is another very well attested ancient Hebrew version of the scriptures. And in fact, this is a Hebrew version of the New Testament, including the New Testament. So it is actually dated to about the 14th century. And in looking at the Shem Tov, I had a hard time finding specific like interlinear versions online, because I can't just read Hebrew outright. I have to have kind of references to go by. I recognize words, but I cannot read through it myself. So in that, I did some research, but I found a scholar, and this scholar, his name was... well, he was from the George Howard Department of Religion at the University of Georgia in Athens, Georgia. But he did this paper on the Shem Tov, and he talked about this here, and says on page 7 of this document, and I'm going to link these things, you're going to be able to find these yourself, but it says here that the Hebrew version of Matthew in the Shem Tov envisions the inclusion of masses among the Gentiles into the kingdom of God. And so it reinforces, again, that these old Hebrew versions, even the Hebrew versions, just to repeat, say that the non-Jews were going to be included in the Messianic age. And in fact, I just bet you that if I went back and just studied Jewish teaching from the rabbis, the Midrash, the Talmud, etc., I would see also that their teachings was that in the Messianic age, that the Gentiles would be included, the non-Jews. I just think the Israel-only proponents are ignorant of these things. They haven't studied these things and don't know them. So all their arguments center around textual criticism in the scriptures, re-arguing the translations of certain words in certain passages to try to get their point across. But, again, it's just like in my last video, the breadth of evidence against them makes them sound ridiculous. So that's the Shem Tov version, Hebrew version of the New Testament, and we were just looking at the book of Matthew. So what we're going to do now is I will show you a different, and we're going to go now into something that we're going to travel back in time with this passage. So the passage I wanted to look at, this is Matthew chapter 20, and it is verse 19. So let me zoom in on this verse for you so you can see it really well. You can see I have it outlined here. This verse, of course, in Matthew is talking about Christ, and he's talking about, behold, we go up to Jerusalem, the Son of Man shall be betrayed unto the priests and scribes. Let me turn off my heater here so it doesn't make noise. Ugh. All right. Jesus will be betrayed to the priests and scribes. They will condemn him to death and deliver him to the Gentiles to mock, to scourge, and crucify. And on the third day he will rise again. So the reason this passage is important, and I picked it kind of out of a hat, but it uses the word Gentiles. In Greek, this is ethnos, nations. And this is the word that's used throughout the New Testament. When Paul is talking about the inclusion of the Gentile nations, when all the different writings that the Israel-only proponents try to change and say, that's not talking about the non-Jews, that's not talking about the Gentile nations, it's talking about the southern tribe of Judah, or whatever. The problem is that this word in this passage, I've used it as an example because this is the word used all through all those passages, ethnos, for the Gentile nations, over and over again. So we're going to examine this and see if in some of these older texts, if it says what I think it was going to say, and that is it's going to be in Hebrew, it's going to be the word goyim. So let's look into this. So I did a Greek analysis of this passage. You just go in, for instance, on BibleHub.com, you can do this, and it takes the verse and goes down each word of the verse, and here it says, and they will, you can read down this English column, and they will betray him, the Gentiles, unto, etc., etc. They will betray him unto the Gentiles. This word Gentiles, as you can see, as I have pointed out, is ethnos. It's a conjugation of the word ethnos, ethnisin, but it is that same word, same root word in Greek, ethnos. So it's the nations, and this is what Israel-only proponents will argue is talking not about the non-Jews, it's only talking about a portion of the Jews that were scattered among the nations. So let's look at that a little further. So what I'm going to do now is bring up the Orthodox Jewish Hebrew Bible. So this is essentially, this is the Bible that modern Jews use, and it is a Hebrew Bible. It's the Orthodox Jewish Hebrew Bible. So modern Jews who are Messianic Christians and who want a version of the Bible that includes the Old and New Testament use a Bible similar to this one, Orthodox Jewish Hebrew Bible. And in fact, when we get to Matthew 20, verse 19, you can see here, and remember it reads right to left, but you see the number 19 here in the middle of the screen. We look at that, how it goes from right to left, and that third word there in Hebrew, guess what word that is? The first letter is a L, a lamed, and that makes this goyim. So the rest of that word there is the word goyim. It is the same word that has been used by Jews throughout all of known history to refer to non-Jewish peoples. So this word is not nations. It's not Jews that were scattered into nations. This is literally a Jewish word for non-Jews, period. It has never meant anything except that. Now, you've seen this, which is the Orthodox Jewish Hebrew Bible. It's a very modern version of it. So now we're going to go back in time a little bit from that. We're sticking with this same passage, Matthew 20, verse 19. So this, I found, is the Sefer Matityahu, which is Matthew in Hebrew. And this gentleman, Lani Mebust, edited and translated this version. He translated the Hebrew, the modern Hebrew, and he said he also used Paleo-Hebrew Phoenician texts. And so it's funny, here is a list of all the different texts that he used to make this translation. The New Greek English Interlinear, the Delitzsch Hebrew Gospels, J. Green's Interlinear, the Franz Delitzsch Hebrew New Testament, the Salkinson Ginsburg Hebrew New Testament, the Hallelujah English Hebrew Parallel, the Interlinear Scripture Analyzer, Tyndale Bible, Geneva, the NASB, etc., etc., the New Jerusalem Bible, and the Peshitta all together. So this guy used all these different versions, including a number of Hebrew versions of this text, to get his translation. And guess what he found? And that was that in Matthew 20, verse 19, he translates that word to goyim, just like all the other guys. Non-Jew. You can see you can just say in your head, non-Jew. Not half Jew, Jews scattered, not southern Jews, not northern Jews, non-Jew. And it has meant that from millennia past. Now we're going to go even further into the past. And this is what sparked me to find and start this video, was because I was reading online, I got wind of a set of manuscripts that was released from the Vatican earlier this past century. And that included some Hebrew versions of the New Testament. And that's what got me on this kick of looking at Hebrew versions of the New Testament, because there are some super old ones. And one of those super old versions is the one we're going to look at now. And it is called the Vatican EBR 100 manuscript. And this is a translation of that Vatican EBR 100 manuscript, and it's a Hebrew manuscript. And it's very ancient, very old. the Hebrew Gospels, this is called the Hebrew Gospels from Sepharad, or Spain. And so these came out of the area of Spain, but they were earlier than the 4th century. And the way we know this is because St. Jerome, who was obviously a Catholic saint who lived in the 4th century, wrote a foreword to each section of these manuscripts. So when they had the manuscripts, they saw they found that Jerome had written forewords to each section of these manuscripts. And so obviously it had dated to prior to St. Jerome in the 4th century. So these are super old Hebrew manuscripts, probably originally Aramaic and from around the time of just after Christ in the 1st and 2nd century. And here is the translation of Matthew 20, verse 19. And I'll zoom in on this. This is interesting. I mean, I didn't expect this when I came here. But you can see here where verse 19 starts, it says, "And they will deliver him," Christ, "to the Nephilim, to make a mockery of him and drive him out." Now, why in the world, you might be asking, would they use the word Nephilim here? And the reason they use the word Nephilim is because, and you can see from the footnote here, we'll go down here and look, the footnote G says, or Gentiles. Well, why would they translate it to Nephilim? Because if you understand the Tower of Babel and what occurred when God scattered the nations, that all the nations that split up and scattered started worshiping pagan gods. Those pagan gods were the fallen. They were the fallen angels, which is a name, the Nephilim. The word Nephilim in Hebrew means fallen ones. So it makes sense that this early on, because they had all that spiritual context they hadn't lost, which we have, was that many of those Gentile nations were worshipers of the Nephilim. And so you know by this that this translation did not intend for this word in any sense to mean any portion of the tribes of Israel or Judah. No sense whatsoever. The Gentiles were the pagan fallen angel worshiping nations, not Israel. And so in just the way we've seen all these different manuscripts, they all have a Hebraic and Aramaic root in the word goyim. This one roots in the same thing, but goes a step further, acknowledging the spiritual degeneracy of the goyim, the Hebrew or the pagan nations, because they worshipped Nephilim. I mean, if we hadn't put the nail in the coffin yet, I don't know what's going to. This is, to me, this is amazing. Just amazing. And I will be doing more research on some of these older Hebrew manuscripts just because of the interesting things that they contain, like this. Now, one other thing I wanted to bring to your attention, and now that we've gone through all these Hebrew manuscripts, we see they all refer to this word goy or goyim for the non-Jews and non-Jewish nations. I want to show you what the word means. So I went to the Jewish Encyclopedia online. What do the Jews say that word means? Because that would definitely tell us something about if it had to do with Israel only, or if it had to do with more than Israel only. The Jews would know because they are the ones that cared. And so I went to the Jewish Encyclopedia. I'll try to zoom this in a little for you so it's easier to see as I go through here. Make sure it's all in view there for you. But you can see as I'm going through the G's, I have the word goy. Now this is the word that we're talking about. It's the root of the word goyim. Any Hebrew word with im on the end is plural. So this is not just goy, it's the plural goyim that we're looking at. But this is the root word. And it says see Gentile. So let's go ahead and we'll click there. So coming to the Jewish Encyclopedia definition of the word Gentile, which is redirected from the word goy, which is what we're looking at here. You can see here the word of Latin origin designates a people not Jewish, commonly applied to non-Jews. The term is said, falsely so, to imply inferiority and to express contempt. If used at all by Jews of modern times, most of them avoiding it altogether, preferring to speak of non-Jews, this construction of its implications must be certainly abandoned as contrary to truth. So here's what happened. So when the scriptures originally used this Hebrew word goy, it did just mean nation or people. And quickly, as time went on, the Jews themselves only started using it to refer to other nations, not themselves. That's why it's now translated as Gentile when people go back and retranslate any Hebrew text. And so originally it just meant nation, but then it quickly was just used by the Jews as Gentile nation, non-Jew nation. And in fact, by the time of Christ in the first century, it had become a slur against other nations. It was not only just a term that referred to the other nations, it was a slur against them, like, you would say to demean someone or make them feel insignificant, because the Jews did see them as insignificant. You can see here it says the word Gentile corresponds to the late Hebrew, probably meaning late temple period. Like I said, the time of Christ, meaning goy, a synonym for nokri, signifying stranger or non-Jew. Non-Jew, right there. In the Hebrew, the Bible goy and its plural goyim originally meant nation, and were applied both to Israelites and non-Israelites, and it gives you some verses there where that's the case. But goy and goyim, however, are employed in many passages, and I would add to that most passages in the Hebrew, to designate nations that are politically distinct from Israel, just as it is in Deuteronomy and Joshua, etc. So I won't read further, it just says more of the same, but just know that now Jews won't even use that word because it is seen as a slander by people of non-Jewish descent. And so if you do hear a Jewish person saying goy about somebody, it is intended now as a slur because that's the only way they use it. And so all this, I just wanted to do this video to kind of bring this, because when I was doing that study and I saw that this was the word that even the New Testament word Gentile or nations was coming from, generally speaking, this word goyim or ethnos, but they are used synonymously, so it's all the same thing, and it's pointing to non-Jewish nations. And this totally destroys the Israel-only notion of that those references were just references to Jews in other nations. That doesn't make any sense with the context we now are seeing. And, my whole last video on Israel only, it, like I said before, was comprehensive. It used so many sources to destroy this notion that when the Jews used that term, it meant their own tribes. But this goes even further. When I saw that this slanderous word that Jews use against other nations in the modern times, I was like, that is the nail in the coffin. This root of this word is a slur against non-Jewish people. So it definitely did not refer to their own people. That would have been considered a slander to them. So they wouldn't have done that. And I don't know how much you may or may not know, and this is the reason this really struck a chord with me, as far as this word goy or goyim, because this is the word that's used in the Talmud ad infinitum to slander Christians and to slander Jesus Christ himself. They use it as not only a derogatory term, but a term of hate towards other nations. And the Talmud has roots in the rabbinical teachings from way back at the time of Christ, etc. So it's just when I heard that word, that was the root, I was like, this is it. Israel only is a joke, because that word cannot mean Jew. No matter what you want it to mean, it cannot mean Jew. It couldn't mean it in the New Testament, and it couldn't mean it near the time of Christ, because at that time, Jews would not have used that word for themselves, period. They just didn't do it. And as we've read, and if you've read the Talmud, by the way, I encourage you to do some research on the Talmud and the writings that are in there. For number one, they use that term as slanderous against people like you and me, but they also use it in horrendously disgusting ways to describe how the goy or the goyim are evil and wicked, destined for destruction. That essentially, well, I don't want to go into all the details, but there's a lot of horrific things written in the Talmud about the non-Jews, and they're always called the goyim, which is this word that's translated Gentile in the New Testament. So I hope this is interesting, and I hope it helps you solidify, as it did for me, solidify your beliefs on and ideas on whether this Israel-only doctrine that has just appeared in the past half decade is even remotely possible. And I think that by the video I did before this one and this one, we have pretty much put this to rest. All the arguments that Israel only makes are made from a weak position of misunderstanding the texts. I hate to say that, but that's truly what it is. They also misunderstand the Jewish nation, and they misunderstand the way they use these terms. So it just is not a viable option for anyone to believe in. It really isn't. But it is attractive to those who, for instance, take a full or hyper-preterist position and want everything to be finished and not relate to them anymore. Of course, this absolves a person of responsibility for their actions, so that makes it attractive too, but coming up with these unfounded and ungrounded arguments to support that notion is, I don't think, a possibility if you've studied the things we've studied together. It's just not a possibility. So thank you for spending the time with me. I pray that you're safe during these days, and that God blesses you in your research and study on your own. Thank you.